Why did the Vatican try to bury the truth about his autopsy? They say Charles II of Spain was born of royal blood, but when they opened his body, they weren't so sure it was human. His testicles were black and shriveled. His heart shrunk like a peppercorn. There wasn't even blood, just the smell of rot and the weight of shame. This was Europe's divine monarch, and he may have died without ever understanding he was alive. But the real horror was what they buried with him. Now picture a table in Madrid, lit by flickering tallow candles. On it, the most powerful man in Spain, cut open like a slab of butcher's meat. The room stinks of sweat, vinegar, and royal decay. A priest in the corner mutters prayers. Nobody looks him in the eye. They're too busy staring at the corpse because this wasn't just a king. This was a divine monarch, a vessel of God. And what they found inside that vessel would shatter the entire illusion. Subscribe now. You don't want to miss this. November 1700. The day Europe's most powerful Catholic monarchy unzipped its God-ordained ruler and realized there was nothing holy inside. No blood, just a foul stew of blackened organs, stone-hard kidneys, and a brain that sloshed when they moved the skull. This wasn't just grotesque. It was blasphemous. The church said kings were chosen by God, but this looked more like God's punchline. And here's the part they really didn't want you to hear. Royal autopsies weren't done. Not in public, not in front of officials, and especially not to kings. But this one was demanded, forced, ripped open for proof, because the truth was too dangerous to bury without slicing it open first. Let's get specific. A team of elite court physicians, some hand-picked by the crown, dissected Charles II of Spain, last of the Habsburg line. What they pulled out was less a body and more a biological crime scene. They started with the heart. It was shriveled, blackened, barely larger than a dried pea. One described it as the size of a peppercorn. Think about that. This was a man who reigned for 35 years. He fought to keep an empire together while hemorrhaging territory. But his heart couldn't pump blood through a dog. And that didn't matter, because there was no blood. Not in the veins, not in the organs, not pooling on the table. Nothing. The surgeons tried multiple incisions, but the body was empty. One court physician reportedly said, "We mistook rot for blood." The stench confirmed it. The body had started putrefying before death. His lungs? Corroded, black with phlegm, spongy with infection. Imagine trying to breathe through a burnt sponge soaked in sewage. Doctors said it was like inhaling tar. Each breath must have scraped like ash and broken glass. Kidneys, stiff, calcified, packed with stones, the size of walnuts. You know what that means. The King of Spain was pissing gravel. For months, maybe years, with no anesthetic, just prayer, pain, and piss that sounded like a drum roll on porcelain. His intestines, distended, bruised, rotted from within. One physician refused to touch them with tongs. He gagged in front of the council. And then, the testicles, blackened, swollen, as if cooked, the note said. Imagine royal jewels marinated in rot and regret. Whatever was supposed to make heirs down there had been dead longer than the king. But the worst part? The skull. They peeled back his scalp and found fluid, buckets of it. His brain sloshed in his head like soup in a broken bowl. Hydrocephalus. Water on the brain. But not just water. Rancid fluid, threaded with pus and the stink of death. They scooped it out. And underneath? Nothing. Human. One court physician, Dr. Juan Cabello, Madrid's top anatomist, described the brain as malformed beyond reckoning. The folds were wrong, the tissue was soft. There were gaps where cognition should have been. And that's when the question finally hit them. Was Charles ever truly conscious? The most powerful king in Catholic Europe might not have understood he was king. Imagine it. You're a physician in 1700, staring into a royal skull full of grey soup, and you realize this wasn't a ruler, this was a puppet. Now picture the reaction of the room. A stiff silence, a few glances toward the priest. Then the whispered question, do we write this down? Because here's the problem. The monarchy didn't just claim divine power, it claimed divine perfection. If God made Charles king, then God made his brain soup, his lungs rot, and his testicles turn to coal. And if that's true, then the entire foundation of European monarchy was a lie. So they covered it, sealed the worst parts of the report in the Vatican archives under clerical supervision. The church didn't just bury Charles's body. They buried the autopsy too. They had to. The divine right of kings doesn't look so divine when the king needs a nursemaid to wipe his chin and a miracle worker to explain why he can't father children. And here's where it gets worse. Charles ruled Spain for 35 years, with no blood, no strength, possibly no real awareness. He was the final boss of inbreeding, barely a person, biologically speaking, more relic than ruler. And yet, he wore the crown. So who was really in charge? Stick around, because we're not just dealing with medical tragedy. We're dealing with a religious conspiracy 3 centuries in the making. And before this is over, we'll talk about another Charles, the one across the sea in England. He got an autopsy too. It was just as disturbing, but for very different reasons. Next, we rewind the bloodline and uncover the human experiment that made this rotten body possible. Let's talk about incest. Real, state-sanctioned, church-approved, generation-layered incest. Because what Charles became was exactly what they built him to be. Before we continue, if you enjoy dark history like this, remember to subscribe, because this is just the beginning. Now let's follow the blood backward. Not that there was much left to follow. Charles II of Spain wasn't just a sickly king. He was the living conclusion of a centuries-long genetic collapse. Think of a royal family tree, with all the branches snapping inward. Now imagine the church nodding approvingly as it folded into itself like origami madness. Born in 1661, Charles II was the last king of the Spanish Habsburgs. His family had been marrying cousins, nieces, and aunts for generations. The royal bloodline wasn't diluted. It was recycled over and over, until the bottle shattered. By the time Charles was born, his inbreeding coefficient of 0.25, a real genetic metric, was higher than if his parents had been full siblings. He wasn't just the product of incest. He was its architectural endpoint. Let me show you how bad it got. His father, Philip IV of Spain, married his niece. His grandfather, Philip III, married his cousin. And his mother, she came from the same twisted loop. This wasn't just royal matchmaking. This was dynastic cannibalism, pre-approved by the Vatican under the banner of purity and power. And the result? You already know he couldn't speak until age 8, or walk unaided until 6, but what the records don't tell you is the day-to-day of a body built by error. Court diaries record chronic seizures, blackouts, and melancholic trances where Charles would sit unmoving for hours, staring through his own reflection in the palace windows. Sometimes, servants would tap his forehead to make sure he was still breathing. He communicated in slurred fragments. He believed he was cursed. He sought miracle healers, drank holy oils, and was once convinced a French sorceress had stolen his semen. Yes, that's in the letters. Now, here's where it gets worse. If Charles couldn't speak, couldn't reason, and couldn't comprehend who was actually ruling Spain. Because the church knew. The Vatican absolutely knew. They were there every step of the way, blessing the marriages, advising the court, approving heirs. They weren't just observers, they were engineers. They designed the structure, and when it started leaking blood and bile, they scrambled to hide the blueprints. His autopsy wasn't a surprise. That was confirmation, and the Vatican moved fast. Within hours of Charles's death, 2 versions of the autopsy were circulating. One public, one secret. The latter was filed directly into the Archivio Segreto Vaticano, the Vatican's secret archives, under an ecclesiastical seal normally reserved for heresies and demonic possession. They treated Charles's autopsy like evidence of the devil. Because if the faithful knew that God's chosen ruler had blackened testicles, no blood, and a brain so misshapen he may not have had conscious thought, then what would happen to the myth of divine monarchy? The church couldn't risk that. Not after 300 years of calling the Habsburgs ordained. So they cleaned up the records. They reissued sanitized portraits. They told the world Charles had died peacefully, surrounded by incense and piety. Meanwhile, a few scribes were quietly gagged. A few pages vanished. The doctors were paid handsomely to forget what they saw. And here's the part they really didn't want you to connect. Spain wasn't the only throne trembling under a holy lie. Across the sea in England, another Charles was unraveling, not from bloodline, but from belief. Also a king, also dead. And he got an autopsy too. One just as strange. Only his horror wasn't inbreeding, it was alchemy. Mercury, madness, and a last-minute betrayal that rewrote English history. We'll get there. But before we do, let me leave you with this. Charles II of Spain didn't die because of illness. He died because of policy. His body was built like that on purpose. And when the machine collapsed, the engineers swept up the parts and prayed no one asked questions. They failed. So far, we've dissected one king's corpse. Now let's cut open another. England's Charles II was not deformed from birth, but unraveled by curiosity. And just like his Spanish namesake, his death wasn't clean. His autopsy wasn't ordinary, and his legacy wasn't as polished as the portraits pretend. Let's rewind to February 2, 1685. Whitehall Palace, London. Charles II of England, the king who brought back the monarchy after Cromwell, is enjoying his morning ritual of court gossip, late-night wine, and a few final alchemical experiments in the cellar. Then, suddenly, he slumps in his chair. His hand begins to twitch. He mutters something about light and fire, then collapses into violent convulsions. The court physicians sprint in, and what do? They bleed him. From both arms, both feet. Then they blister his skin with caustic cups. Then they pump his stomach with a laxative so strong it was once used to treat syphilitic horses. And he's not done yet. One of them decides to shave his head and apply a hot poultice made from pigeon droppings and powdered pearls. Let that image sit with you for a second. The King of England, convulsing on the floor and covered in royal bird paste. And this was just the prelude to what they called treatment. When he finally died 4 days later, they opened him up. And what they found, well, this part didn't make it into the official record, at least not until much later. The autopsy revealed his brain was swollen. His cerebral ventricles were flooded with fluid. The veins in his skull had burst. His tissue had turned a strange mottled grey. Mercury poisoning, modern experts say. But at the time, they just wrote it off as bad humours. Now here's where it gets complicated. Because Charles wasn't just dabbling in chemistry. He was obsessed with alchemy, obsessed with immortality, obsessed with the divine secrets of matter. He had a hidden laboratory under Whitehall where he experimented with mercury distillations and transmutational rituals. Every breath in that room was toxic. Some historians now believe Charles was slowly poisoning himself for years, chasing gold, chasing God, or maybe just chasing meaning in a world he couldn't control. His fascination with eternal life may have shortened it, but the final twist came after the heart stopped. On his deathbed, Charles, the same man who restored Protestant rule in England, now converted to Catholicism, in secret. In England, Catholicism wasn't just a religion, it was a spy network, a foreign power. The Pope in Rome was seen as a shadow king, trying to reclaim England's soul, so Charles switching teams in secret? That was a royal middle finger to everything he publicly stood for. Charles converted not publicly, not ceremonially, but in whispers, behind curtains, with Father John Huddleston. This was the same Catholic priest who once smuggled him to safety as a child, now smuggled into the palace through a hidden stairwell. "You have saved my life twice," Charles whispered. "Once my body, and now my soul." It was treasonous, really. If the people had known, civil war could have erupted again. So the truth was buried, not in the ground, but in silence. The English Charles died convulsing, choking, and turning grey, but his country saw a peaceful monarch, faithful to the end. It was a lie, wrapped in lace. And that makes two Charleses. One born broken, one broken by obsession. Both kings, both autopsied, both betrayed. But before we tie the final threads, we need to return to Madrid. Because while one Charles dissolved in mercury and secrecy, the other was being used like a puppet, embalmed in lies and buried with an empire's shame. Let's go back. Back to Spain. Back to the man who was never supposed to be king, never supposed to be conscious, and, if the Vatican had its way, never supposed to be cut open. Charles II of Spain didn't rule. He was ruled through. Ministers would gather in dark chambers, not to hear his will, but to script it. Ceremonies were staged like theatre. Gestures became decrees. His own mother, Mariana of Austria, acted as regent well into his adulthood. Not because she clung to power, but because Charles never really took it. Visitors were instructed on when to bow, what not to say, and when to pretend he had spoken. Diplomatic meetings were strictly timed. 5 minutes, enough to see him blink, maybe nod, and then he'd be wheeled away like a haunted prop in a royal puppet show. Letters from foreign ambassadors didn't ask, "What did the king decide?" They asked, "Who's actually pulling the strings this week?" Now, picture that for a moment. Picture a king sitting on the throne, mouth slightly agape, blinking slowly as bishops whisper in Latin, courtiers nod gravely, and someone gently lifts his arm to bless a document he never read. That was governance in Spain for 35 years. And yet, the fiction held, because it had to. Because if Charles wasn't really king, then monarchy wasn't really divine. If the chosen of God drooled through ceremonies he didn't understand, what did that say about God's plan? That's why the autopsy had to be sealed. Not because it was gross, because it was true. The Vatican locked the worst of it behind centuries of dust and iron, because they knew one disemboweled divine right, and it all unravels. Monarchies crumble, faith fractures, empires fall apart. So they lied. And if you're wondering, was Spain the only one? Well, remember the other Charles. Across the sea, England's golden king. His final act? A secret Catholic conversion in a country that had burned people alive for less. 2 kings, one destroyed by family, one destroyed by faith, and in the end, both buried under lies. They called it divine right, but it looked a lot like human failure, dressed in robes and perfumed to cover the rot. Because what they really buried wasn't just 2 monarchs, They buried the illusion that anyone was in control. And that illusion held for a while, until centuries later, one quiet historian in a Vatican archive turned a page, squinted at the Latin, and started gagging. Thank you for watching.